Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 255, and this time I'm going to talk about Bauhaus's debut single, or EP, however you want to call it, from 1979 on Small Wonder Records, Bela Lugosi's Dead. This is not a first pressing. There were only 5,000 of those. They were pressed on white vinyl. This is either a second or a third pressing, depending on how you interpret the markings in the dead wax. This is, of course, a 45. Now, normally I only review LPs, but I'm making an exception in this case. First of all, because there's about 14 minutes of music on here, so it almost qualifies at least as an EP anyway. And secondly, because this is absolute ground zero for Gothic rock. Bauhaus has only ever had 4 members who were school friends from in and around Northampton in the UK. That includes the singer Peter Murphy, the guitarist Daniel Ash, and the Haskins brothers, Kevin, who's a drummer, and David J., who plays bass. In nursery school / kindergarten in the early 1960s, David J. meets and befriends Daniel Ash, and they stay friends all the way through school. In the mid-70s, the Haskins brothers and Ash begin to think about forming a band, and this gets Ash thinking about inviting his friend, Peter Murphy, who, along with Ash, went to a different school, a Catholic school. He was principally interested in Murphy, not because Murphy could sing, he didn't know if he could sing, but because he had what Ash felt was the right look for the band. Murphy was the same age as Ash and David J. Haskins. He was born in 1957 in Northampton. He'd grown up in the neighboring town of Wellingborough in a very strict Irish Catholic family, which probably has something to do with the overall tenor of Gothic rock. And because there wasn't a Catholic school, he ends up going to Northampton, the bigger town in the area, where there was a Catholic school, and that was where he and Ash became friends. Ash asked Murphy to join their musical ventures initially, but Murphy at that point wasn't interested. So the Hawkins brothers and Ash then get involved in a bunch of different musical ventures, different bands, which were good practice but didn't amount to much more. By 1978, their latest venture, a band called The Craze, had not really worked out. Ash was feeling that David J. was a little bit of a controlling bandmate, so decided he wanted a bit of, a fresher scene. Doesn't work with the Hawkins brothers for the moment, reaches out to Murphy again a few years later to see if Murphy wants to get involved in the band. Now, Murphy at this point, like Ash, was out of school. He was quite artistic, but he was also quite socially withdrawn, and he'd rejected the chance to go to art college. He was doing art at home. He was working in the days at a print shop, but things weren't necessarily really happening for him, so maybe this was an opportune time. Anyway, he says yes to Ash. They get together, they start rehearsing, and there's an immediate click. And in that very first rehearsal, they end up writing the song In the Flat Field, which ends up on the Bauhaus debut album a couple of years later. That's all going well, so now they need bandmates. Ash reaches out to Kevin Haskins to come in on drums, but for the moment he keeps David J. at arm's length. He brings in a guy instead called Chris Barber on bass, and they form a band called SR. SR plays for a few weeks, doesn't really work out, and so eventually Ash relents. Barber's gone, calls up David J. He comes in. There's a pretty immediate connection with Murphy, and there's a pretty immediate sense of the kind of concept they want the band to be, aided by the fact that David J. comes in with the idea of using Bauhaus 1919, later shortened to Bauhaus, named after the German art and design and architecture movement of the early 1920s, as their band name and kind of aesthetic. Right away, they began to write and play their own material. Their very first gig was New Year's Eve 1978 at the Cromwell pub in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire, which is now gone. The pub, not Wellingborough. Their performances were full of energy, and in early 1979, a friend of theirs videotaped one of their gigs and tried to shop it around to various labels to get some uptake. That wasn't too successful because apparently none of the labels actually had VHS players at the time to be able to play that, so they decided they needed a demo record. Bauhaus went into Beck Studios in Wellingborough on the 26th of January 1979, just 6 weeks after they had formed, into a studio which was really no more than an addition onto the house of the engineer and owner, a guy called Derek Tompkins. Tompkins was in his 50s, he was significantly older than the band, and he had a personal style, apparently, which verged on goading or needling the musicians to try and get a performance out of them. But despite that, he gained their trust because of the quality of the sound recording he was able to achieve, which is absolutely fantastic. They recorded 5 songs that day, the first of those being Bela Lugosi's Dead, which was almost 10 minutes long and stemmed from a conversation the band had had about the erotic content of vampire movies. That day of recording, Peter Murphy had showed up with a cold, which, in a strange parallel to Ozzy Osbourne during the recording of the debut record for Black Sabbath, gave his voice kind of an otherworldly, spooky tone, which was incredibly well suited to a very spooky track. The band were big reggae fans, and they were also big fans of The Clash, who themselves were big reggae fans. And as a consequence, they were great appreciators of dub reggae, which is typically instrumental, has lots of sound effects. And so that approach also found its way onto the recording of Bela Lugosi's Dead. There's lots of sound effects, the bass is super high in the mix, lots of delay, lots of reverb, and in the end, the results are absolutely spectacular. The band are totally blown away in a session which cost them for the day £11. He then took the resulting acetate to all the big labels, to Virgin, to EMI, all the labels, and basically shut down across the board. It's not commercial enough, it's too long, can you edit it down to 3 minutes, and so on. Then they decide to take it to a smaller label, a super tiny label actually, run out of a record shop in northeastern London in Walthamstow called Small Wonder Records, run by a guy called Pete Stennett. So they drop off the record and they come back a few hours later to see what he thinks, just as he's closing up the shop. So in they go, he locks the doors, he says, I don't quite know about this record, I have to think about it some more, I want to play it one more time. So they all stood around his record player, he puts the needle down, and as the band says, 9 minutes felt like 9 hours. And at the end of that listening session, in Stennett's own words, I didn't give a fuck how long it was. I loved it and I wanted to share it. He did a first pressing of 5,000 copies. Nobody can quite remember why those 5,000 copies were on white vinyl. When the band got their white vinyl copies, they drove straight down to the BBC, where John Peel had his radio show. They basically bullshitted the front desk staff, saying that they were expected by Peel. They were dressed up like a band. In they go. Peel receives them, introduces them live on the air and says, play the record. So they go back down to their car and they hear, as they're driving away on the radio, their record being played. And apparently the switchboard absolutely lit up with people wanting to hear it again and again and again. After that, things really took off for Bauhaus. They had their own session with John Peel live on the air. They were booked into a club called Billy's in London as a house band for an extended residency. The single never actually charted in any serious way, except in some minor independent charts, but it didn't really matter because they had created a whole scene where they were at the center. They captured the zeitgeist in a bottle and they were really on their way. Their label, Small Wonder, didn't really have the capacity in distribution terms to back them any longer, so they end up signing for the newly founded label AD Records in 1980, and it's that label that puts out their debut record the same year, In the Flat Field. This being a single, side one is of course entirely occupied with Bela Lugosi's Dead. Now, I'd mentioned that the band had been chit-chatting about the erotic qualities of vampire movies. After that conversation, Ash is messing around with riffs and he comes up with a riff that he thinks is pretty spooky. He phones up David J to say, listen, I've got this great riff. And David J says, as it happens, I too have been feeling inspired and I've written this lyric about Bela Lugosi, which is frankly an all-world lyric. Just as the production of the song is fantastic and the performances are great, lyrics like the bats have left the bell tower, the victims have been bled are frankly just magic. Another point about the music is that, as noted, this is heavily influenced by dub reggae in terms of the sound effects and the instrumentation and some of the mix, but it isn't a reggae beat. Kevin Haskins, drum teacher, had taught him 3 different beats, a pop beat, a jazz beat, and a bossa nova beat, and so he thought he'd try the bossa nova beat. So this is actually, if you listen to it, a bossa nova song, although we are truly a long way from Rio at this point. It's a post-punk masterpiece, but also, frankly, it's a pop masterpiece, which still sounds incredible and very fresh to this day. I've talked a lot about the A-side, but the B-side is pretty darn good too. It features principally the track Boys. The funky feel and the rhythm of this is a lot like what I really like about Gang of Four records. The guitar is brilliantly captured, and Murphy really proves that he's a natural, basically. He's just a master of atmosphere. All that said, the 1 minute and 20 seconds of Dark Entries, which is tacked on here, it's a bit of a strange choice. It is a great song, would ultimately be released down the line, and you can hear that, but the sound quality is not great, and it's very clearly unfinished, so again, not sure why. Bauhaus really had legs as a band. They had a really clear concept of what they wanted to be, and their early catalog never really runs out of gas during that initial run. All of that early catalog, in my view, is worth picking up. Even though they have some amazing peaks later on, one of my favorites is Silent Hedges, which actually has a very similar vibe to this. This is pretty much the unchallenged greatest thing they ever did. You don't have to be a goth to dig this, you just have to be a fan of brilliantly produced, spooky rock and roll. This record is essential to understanding the 1980s, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.